During the Second World War, one British fighter pilot became famous above all others. He was Douglas Bader. His name evokes some rather different memories.
He was a god, really, to us.
He tried to brutalise people, Bader.
He was just aggressive nearly all the time.
I don't think all the time I knew him he said please or thank you to me.
I thought he was a tremendous man. I couldn't fault him.
I just think that he was completely unique, and his faults I didn't care about then.
The man was a myth. Everything he did was an act, in my opinion.
He thought himself indestructible. He'd get away with anything.
Battle of Britain Day at North Weald. Group Captain Bader, the legless fighter ace and ex-prisoner of war, led the fly-past in his Spitfire. And what a sight it was for Londoners this fine, peaceful September morning of 1945.
At the war's end, Douglas Bader was cast as the hero of one of his country's greatest victories. The courage of the crippled pilot symbolized the grit of a crippled nation in its darkest hour. A decade later, one of the best-loved British films ever made was about Bader.
Now stand back, all of you. I want to do this on my own.
The story of how one man lost his legs in a terrible accident and then fought back to become a wartime ace thrilled millions. The film turned Bader into a worldwide star and a quintessential British hero. At every Battle of Britain reminder, Bader was the man the cameras wanted to capture.
And we've both been blubbing while this thing's been going on, and now we can just get our voices back, so I hope it comes out.
You had tears in your eyes, did you?
Running down my face, oh boy. I don't make any bones about it. After all, so did Churchill. Why shouldn't I?
But the real Douglas Bader was a more complex person than the simplistic myth created by cinema and newsreel. As those closest to him acknowledge, he was not always the popular hero, but a man who aroused extremes of feeling.
Well, you either loved him or you loathed him. I mean, I don't think there was any in between. You know, I don't think I'd ever heard anyone say, oh, he's quite nice, he's okay, you know. And I mean, they either say, oh, he's great, he's a super guy, or he's an absolute bastard, one or the other.
Douglas Bader was born in London in 1910. But after just a few months, his mother and father abandoned him and returned to India, where his father worked. For the first 2 years of his life, he was left in the care of relatives. By the time the First World War broke out, the family was reunited and living in Kew. His father went off to fight, and Douglas and his mother finally got to know each other.
She hated Douglas. She only wanted to be with his brother, Derek. She never ever wanted to be with him. She never loved Douglas at all. So I don't think that there was a blade of love or happiness there.
At the age of 8, he was sent away to boarding school. Once again, he was on his own.
It probably made him very determined. It gave him the sort of feeling that he'd got to do everything for himself, that he'd got to overcome this feeling of rejection.
The void was never filled by his father. After the war, he didn't return home. The marriage had failed, and he died in 1922. More and more, the young Douglas came to rely on his uncle, Cyril Burge. At the end of World War I, Uncle Cyril had been appointed the first adjutant of the new Royal Air Force Training College at Cranwell in Lincolnshire. As a boy, Douglas stayed with the Burges and was captivated by Cranwell. He desperately wanted to be a part of it, and at the age of 18, achieved his ambition by winning a scholarship to go there. The RAF became his surrogate family. Having lacked any attention at home, he now craved the notice of his peers at Cranwell.
The most exhibitionist character was Douglas Bader. Whenever he came into a room, he always made his presence felt. He didn't leave it to us to find out. He spoke loudly and swaggered into the room, if you understand what I mean.
Wilfred Oulton was the year below Bader at Cranwell.
I think because of his early family life, possibly, that Douglas was insecure internally, emotionally, but was absolutely determined to get over this by being the leader, the number one at absolutely everything, to show that far from being fragile in any way, he was the tops. And this marked everything he did. In his playing of rugby, for instance, he was not the team player. Once he got the ball, he was going to score the try. He was out for Bader all the time.
It didn't stop him becoming one of the finest rugby fly halves of his generation. Here he's playing for the combined services against the Springboks. He would almost certainly have represented England. Bader graduated from Cranwell in 1930. He was the runner-up for the top prize, the Sword of Honour. He was a star, and he knew it.
I think on the whole he regarded everybody as being inferior to him in some way. That's the impression one got. And of course, in many cases that was quite right, but one didn't like to feel so.
Tubby Myrmigan, another Air Force contemporary, met Bader just after he'd left Cranwell.
I always thought Douglas was a bit cocky, obviously very overconfident, and he did not suffer fools gladly. Even as a young man, definitely struck me like that. The word cocky, unfortunately, is a nasty expression, but he was.
In addition to everything else, Bader was a top pilot. He was selected as a member of the Air Force aerobatic team, which used to thrill the crowds at the Hendon air shows.
43 Squadron looping. These machines are all tied together by cord, which you perhaps can see.
In 1931, Bader and his teammate won the Hendon Pairs competition. The Times said Bader provided the most thrilling spectacle ever seen in exhibition. But some who saw Bader flying were getting worried.
Douglas was a real show-off, and he could do everything. Upward rolls, half rolls off loops, bits of inverted flying, everything. But he inclined to do everything rather low, and Douglas went to the extreme of going very low indeed.
Low flying had already caused 2 fatal accidents, and a new rule banning it was brought in. But, despite reprimands from his senior officers, Bader repeatedly ignored the rule. Then, on the 14th of December 1931, egged on by 2 friends, he broke it again. He tried to do a slow roll at 50 feet. It was an act of incredible recklessness. What happened next has become a classic scene of British cinema.
It had to come sooner or later, and I thought the way he went about flying was not quite right. So I wasn't at all surprised. I was very sorry indeed. Not heartbroken, but very, very sorry. I thought, what a shame.
Bader, still only 21, very nearly died. Both his legs had to be amputated. For the rest of his life, he would have to live with that one moment of idiocy.
He just said it was his own bloody stupid fault, which it was. And he made no bones about it. And he said if he'd lost his legs any other way through somebody else's fault, he didn't know how he'd have felt about it. But as it was his own fault, he'd got nobody else to blame. So he just had to get on and live his life without them.
Bader made a miraculous recovery, but the RAF wouldn't allow him to fly with his artificial legs. It was a devastating blow, and he left the Air Force in 1933. There was one consolation. During his convalescence, he had met Thelma Edwards, who would become his first wife. He was determined to show her family he was just like any other man.
My sister said she had this man friend coming round to the flat, and I think I was 11 years old, my brother was 12, and we were warned that we were not to sort of stare at him or behave in any peculiar way, just to treat him as though he was exactly like anybody else. And so I can remember that we were sat side by side on the sofa in the drawing room, and we stared at his legs, and the tension was definitely mounting. It was strained, and suddenly he got his pipe out and he banged it out on his leg. And of course we roared with laughter. We thought that was wonderful.
His sports car became his substitute for a fighter aircraft. The loss of his legs had not curbed the compulsion to be a daredevil.
He drove extremely fast. He didn't have any regard for sort of watching out for anybody else. We loved him driving fast. My brother and I, we sat in the back telling him to go faster all the time, and he thought that was wonderful, and then he went faster still. And of course he did have 2 accidents.
But the bravado masked torment. For the next 6 years, Bader was chained to a desk, which he hated. The Air Force had been the lifeline which had relieved the miseries of childhood. Without it, that misery clouded over again.
Oh my dear, he looked like thunder. Didn't want to talk. And if he did, he used foul language, you know, bugger off this and do that, and when we were only trying to be nice. But he only wanted to hear this one thing: you can go back.
There was one hope: war. It would be the only way Bader could get back into the Air Force. He was one of the very few Englishmen who welcomed Germany's every aggressive move, only because it brought war closer.
He was very excited indeed. He was the only person in our household who was absolutely longing for it to come, because he said, they'll have to have me now. And of course my sister was absolutely upset. I mean, she didn't want him to do it at all. She said, this is ridiculous. I mean, you of all people, you don't have to go.
In September 1939, war was declared. 2 months later, Flying Officer Bader was back in the Air Force. After 8 years of intense frustration, he was pumped up and ready to go. On rejoining the Air Force, Douglas Bader had to take a flying test, but there was a problem. Unlike the new Spitfires and Hurricanes, the test plane, a Harvard, had brakes on the pedals, which a man with 2 tin legs wouldn't be able to operate. Luckily for Bader, his examiner was an old Cranwell friend, Rupert Lee.
So Rupert said, don't worry about the aeroplane on the ground, boy. You just fly around and we'll do a few circuits and bumps, which of course Douglas did perfectly because he could fly aeroplanes beautifully. And when they got onto the ground, Rupert just operated the brakes and no one was ever the wiser.
With a little help from his friend, Bader passed. He was posted to 19 Squadron at Duxford near Cambridge, flying Spitfires. He met a lot of old pals. It was like coming home. Bader was determined never to give in to his disability. He even played squash, once against Tubby Murmigan.
I went to his room whilst he changed, and there he stripped off, and for the first time I saw him without legs. These horrible stumps, one of which was rather red because it had been rubbing. Of course, he slumped onto the bed and then fell onto the floor. And you had one leg, which was doing most of the work, and the other one was just dragging behind. It was very crab-like, very unpleasant. I didn't like the look of it. And then I thought, my God, what a mess. How did he cope? How does he cope?
The loss of his legs had not changed but exaggerated Bader's essential nature. It made him, if that was possible, more aggressive, more bloody-minded, more determined to be number one.
At a fighter station, things begin to warm up. Fighter pilots dash out of their mess to make a mess of a Messerschmitt or two.
Deprived of action for so long, Bader had an intense desire to get at the Germans. He truly reflected the newsreel propaganda.
There's going to be a spot of bother for the Hun. The Spitfires are getting ready to spit, and in a moment their daredevil pilots will be streaking away into the blue to give the Nazis another trouncing.
But in the real world, these were dark times. France had fallen, and in June 1940, Bader's squadron went into action to cover the retreat from Dunkirk. Tubby Myrmigan vividly remembers Bader returning from his first air battle.
Up comes Douglas. I got 5 for cert, Tubby, 5 for cert. I thought to myself, you bloody old liar. Who's confirmed them? Now, confirmation of a shooting down was pretty difficult unless you had somebody very close behind you who actually saw the aircraft being hit and shot down. But to have that done 5 times, to me, was not on.
Bader's claim was a wild overestimate. In fact, he had only shot down 1 German. Perhaps he was bragging because up till then he'd been having a difficult war. In March 1940, Bader had crashed a Spitfire. He'd made the basic mistake of trying to take off in the wrong pitch, the equivalent of a car trying to accelerate away from traffic lights in top gear. The plane was a write-off, and he smashed his tin legs. For a while, his normal self-confidence deserted him.
He was very worried because he thought that they might change their minds again, that if they thought that he was always going to be breaking up aeroplanes which were in desperately short supply, they might say, well, this won't do, we've made a mistake.
Then one night in June, he crashed a second time, coming into land guided by a flare path. Again, the plane was a write-off.
He came in far too fast, far too high, landed 3/4 of the way up the runway, went straight for a hedge and finished up sort of upside down, nearly. Well, I rushed over there in the Jeep to find him hanging on his straps. And I think, I said, Douglas, you all right? He said, yes. He said, this bloody flare path is laid out badly. I thought, good old lack of humility. He's blaming somebody else now. And it was just sheer bad flying.
Shortly after the second crash, Bader was summoned to a meeting with his commanding officer, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. He was expecting a carpeting.
He tried to explain the crash, started to try and explain it, but Lee Mallory cut him short and said, I didn't send you for that. I'm telling you, you've got a squadron, 242. Douglas himself said to me, I nearly fell through the floor.
Lee Mallory had recognized Bader's qualities of leadership and sent the newly promoted squadron leader up to Colditz in Norfolk. His new squadron, 242, had been badly shot up in France. In just 11 days, it had lost 8 pilots. Bader immediately set about boosting the morale of young, demoralized pilots, like Flying Officer Dennis Crowley Milling.
He was approaching 30, which was old for a fighter pilot. We were all in our 20, 21, and fear was always there. And the one thing he helped you more than anything else was conquering fear. He was always encouraging you.
Tubby Myrmigan had also noticed how Bader relieved the tension of nervous young pilots about to go into battle.
The atmosphere was a little tense because nobody quite knew what was going to happen, although they were pretty bloodthirsty. Suddenly I'd hear thump, 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 thump coming down the corridor. This was the approach of Douglas Bader. The door would burst open. He'd clear a passageway to the coffee machine. Get out of the way, chaps, I want a cup of coffee. And the morale went up straight away. He was showing off, mind you, showing off like mad.
While loved by his inner circle, like the pilots of 242, Bader could come across very differently to people who weren't part of it. David Cox was a pilot with a neighbouring squadron. He just landed after shooting down a Messerschmitt in a dogfight which had left his own plane a write-off. Bader may have wrecked 2 Spitfires himself, in avoidable accidents, but he wasn't wearing it from anyone else.
Douglas Bader came round with our CO to have a look, see what had happened. So I was sort of very enthusiastically said, "I got one, sir." And Bader turned round with some language we won't repeat here, that 1 for 1 is no so-and-so good. He was sort of God Almighty and greatly respected. So I was downfallen a little bit. And actually, Bader was a little bit wrong there, because it wasn't exactly 1 for 1. They'd lost a pilot and we still had a pilot.
When the alarm does come, not a second is lost.
Blue section only.
By late July 1940, the Battle of Britain was underway. But Bader, later portrayed as a top Battle of Britain ace, in reality played a relatively minor role in the fighting.
Bei den deutschen Jagdfliegern an der Kanalküste. Englische Flieger.
Having overrun France, the Luftwaffe's bombers and fighter escorts could take off from just across the Channel. So the battle mainly took place over southeast England, which was covered by Fighter Command's 11 Group. But Bader's squadron, 242, was in 12 Group, which covered the Midlands and East Anglia. As the battle was fought to the south, Bader and his men waited with mounting frustration.
Douglas wanted to get into the action. We would hear through the Y service that they were forming up in the Pas-de-Calais area, ready for attack. And Douglas saying, well, why don't they get us airborne?
On August the 30th, 7 full weeks into the battle, Bader and 242 Squadron were finally scrambled. Their target was German bombers, who, as it turned out, were without their usual escort of the best German fighter, the Messerschmitt 109. Peter Brown, a Battle of Britain pilot, has documented Bader's role in the battle, which he thinks is exaggerated.
It was a relatively easy action. There were no 109s within miles, and that changes the pattern of the battle. And they did very well, in fact. And when he landed, they had claimed 12 shot down. In fact, research shows that it was 4, which is very different.
Bader's commander, Trafford Lee Mallory, was delighted with the 12 unconfirmed kills claimed by 242. Bader told him, if we'd only had more fighters, we could have hacked the Hun down in scores. Persuaded by Bader, Lee Mallory created a big wing of 3, later 5 squadrons to operate together under Bader's command. The big wing would cause a bitter Air Force row. Bader's plan was this. As soon as radar detected the massive German bombers building up over northwest France, he wanted the big wing to be scrambled. Bader calculated that by the time his wing got to East Kent, it would be at the optimum height for attacking the incoming Germans.
What he wanted to do was to get off the ground, get right down to the south on a line between Ashford and Folkestone. That's what he said, oh boy, between Ashford and Folkestone. And he wanted to patrol that and be ready with his 3 squadrons there to take a first poke at these fellows coming in.
It was, of course, a plan designed to make Bader personally Fighter Command's front line of attack, something he was desperate to be. But Bader's zeal in promoting the big wing, encouraged by his boss Lee Mallory, angered many of his Air Force colleagues.
He made a real nuisance of himself in trying to impose his ideas on those who were at the front of the battle, in the Battle of Britain. And he created a great deal of unnecessary friction by trying to take over, to usurp, in fact, the leadership of the operation. And that came in for quite a bit of criticism, not from his own wing, who regarded him very highly and thought that he must be right, but from other impartial observers who thought, well, that's not the right way to go about it.
The big wing flew on just 5 occasions in the battle, not in attack as Bader wished, but as backup defense. its massive presence in the air dealt a devastating psychological blow to the Luftwaffe's pilots, who had been told that the RAF was down to its last few planes. Bader and Lee Mallory's lobbying persuaded the majority of the air staff that the big wing was the best fighter tactic. But post-war records show that the evidence supporting its performance was dubious.
The big wing undoubtedly overclaimed by 3-1, and this was incredibly misleading if you're going to make a decision on a change of tactics. And the whole of the glory of the big wing, if you like, was based on these erroneous claims.
Sir Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, got fed up with Bader's campaigning. He wrote a memo saying, "A good deal of the ill feeling which has been engendered has been directly due to young Bader, who, whatever his other merits, suffers from an overdevelopment of the critical faculty." After the war, Bader entered the Battle of Britain Hall of Fame. He remembered those times fondly.
The fun, they were a wonderful, I mean, it's ridiculous at this age, talking about it, but they were a wonderful collection of chaps. They was, they were gay, they were fun, they were cheerful, and, as Whitney said, there was a camaraderie.
But some of his fellow pilots, though not denying Bader's great bravery and morale boosting, think the legend should be put in perspective.
A number of people regard him as the Battle of Britain hero, and I think that's wrong. Douglas Bader was no more a Battle of Britain hero than perhaps 1,000 other pilots. There were so many others who shot down more aircraft, led more squadrons, more flights, fought continuously in 11 Group, which was an entirely different war from fighting in 12 Group.
The irony is that Bader would have given his eye teeth to have been in the thick of every action. Given his limited opportunities, he did well, shooting down 4 German planes, only one short of the 5 needed to qualify as a Battle of Britain ace. The top scorer, a Czech pilot, Josef František, shot down 17. The top British ace, Sergeant Pilot Ginger Lacey, scored 15. But despite his frustrations, the battle had been good for Bader. He'd made his name, and his mentor Lee Mallory soon promoted him. In under a year, he'd gone from being a lowly flying officer to wing commander. Even by the standards of quick wartime promotion, it was a stunning rise. In March 1941, the newly promoted Wing Commander Douglas Bader arrived at Tangmere, near Chichester, to take command of a wing of 3 squadrons. Johnny Johnson was one of his young pilots. He recalls how Bader always prided himself on being the best flyer in town and used to give regular displays of his aerobatic prowess.
He'd pull up in his Spitfire 5 into a near vertical climb, and he'd do 2 upward rolls and then bring it right over to complete the loop and then do a roll off the top. And then he'd come down and he'd say, well, of course, I'd like to do 3 upward rolls, you see, but he said the engine's not powerful enough. And once or twice when he tried to do the 3rd roll, he spun out of it.
But then one day, a new pilot, Flight Lieutenant Gibbs, arrived at Tangmere.
Gibbs got into his Spitfire, did the fast upward roll, dug a 2nd upward roll, and Douglas said, "My Christ, he's trying to do, he'd never do it, old boy." He said, "He'll never do it." I mean, I could have told him, but he did a 3rd upward, immaculate roll, and then completed the loop and rolled a half roll off the top. Magnificent display.
And what was Douglas Bader's reaction?
Oh, I think he was bloody livid, yes, I think he was livid.
After that, aerobatic displays were cancelled. As usual, Bader inspired devotion from the officers and men closest to him. One was Sergeant Pilot Alan Smith.
He said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Smith, sir." He said, "Right, you'll do. You're my number 2. And God help you if I get shot down." And it was like God saying, "Come up and look after heaven for me." You know, so I was thrilled to bits.
Behind his mask, Sergeant Pilot Bob Morton.
He was a god, really, to us. I mean, he was the be-all, the end-all, everything. We never imagined we could emulate him. At least I certainly didn't. But he was there, and we were very grateful for it.
The Barders' home, the Bay House, just outside Bognor, was the social hub. His young officers were like puppies at his feet.
Often at the end of a day's flying, he'd say, well, come round for bacon and eggs this evening, and there'll be some beers. And we'd all sit on the floor, pilot officers, in his house, in the bosom of his family and so on. And we were rather like his sons, if you would like to put it that way.
But the admiration was not universal. Some of the Tangmere ground crew saw Barder's darker side.
He tried to brutalise people, Barder. He was violent in his manner and violent in his style. He gave we people on the ground the feeling of fear rather than togetherness. He was the only man that I ever knew that had this attitude.
He was just aggressive nearly all the time, as far as I was concerned. And it takes a great deal of effort to be like that. It's difficult to explain why he was so unsociable, to say the least. Never please or thank you. He didn't know the meaning of the word. He seemed to have a very severe inferiority complex, and I don't mean as a result of losing his legs. Way back before then, if they say suffering brings out the best in people, well, I doubt whether it did in his case.
In the film, Reach for the Sky, Barder is shown as having an understanding relationship with his Battle of Britain ground crew.
Mr. West, I've collected a few bullet holes. The instruments are smashed and the cockpit's full of glycol. I want this aircraft ready in half an hour.
I'm sorry, sir, this job will take a couple of days.
That's no good. I said half an hour.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't let this aircraft fly, sir.
All right, Mr. West. Get it done as soon as possible.
But at Tangmere, sympathy was in shorter supply. One day, George Reed, helped by the flight sergeant and the chiefy, was grappling with a broken undercarriage on Barder's plane. Barder screeched up in his car.
Then the man stumped towards us, making all sorts of foul language gestures towards us that this aircraft wasn't fit to fly. Banging his stick on the bonnet of the car, that's made a big impression on me, that did, because the man was sort of violent in his attitude, very much so. At least he was towards me and the chiefy. He got very close to the chiefy. He could probably have hit the chiefy. He didn't do, but he was in that sort of an attitude. He was all fired up.
In 1941, having thwarted the German offensive the previous year, Fighter Command was trying to turn the tables. The job for Barder's wing was to escort bomber raids over northern France and entice German fighters up into the air for dogfights. The plan was spelt out by Fighter Command's C&C, Sholto Douglas.
In the Battle of Britain, Fighter Command was on the defensive. Now the initiative is ours, and every day with our fighter sweeps and escorted bomber raids, we are carrying the war to the enemy. We like it better that way.
The sweeps by Barder's wing caused relatively little damage, but at this early stage of the war, the important thing was to be seen to be doing something aggressive and raise national morale. It was a role tailored for the bloodthirsty and fearless Barder.
He'd stump in and look at the board with the ribbons on it over the powder carrier and say, a bloody good show, now we'll get a few krauts a day, chaps on. And the morale was really tremendous through that one man.
When the battle was over and everybody had gone home, Douglas Barder and the Tangmere wing were still, if we'd any ammunition and petrol left, were still tooling around France in case Douglas could find something to shoot at. Once we crossed the English coast on the way back to Tangmere, and I tucked myself in alongside Douglas, and he'd slide his cockpit hood back, get his pipe out, get his lighter going, light his pipe, and was sitting there jovially smoking his pipe at peace with the world. And quite not unaware, obviously knew he was sitting on the petrol tank, but it didn't seem to disturb him.
By August 1941, Bader was a national figure. Bader memorabilia, like this signed photograph, were sold all over Britain. Articles about his daring do appeared regularly in the national press. It was as if, to his family and pilots, he'd become immortal.
We never thought for a minute that he would ever be shot down. He managed to impart this belief of his invincibility, and therefore that sort of rubbed off on them.
I think he was desperately overconfident. Overconfident. He always had been. I'm Douglas Bader. You can't get me.
But his luck was about to run out. On August the 9th, 1941, Bader set off on what should have been a routine sweep over northern France. But things began to go wrong. His radio talkback failed, and then his airspeed indicator went.
I think he was physically tired, and that affected his judgment, I think, on this day. A normal chap, I think, if I'd have been leading the wing, I'd have turned back, handed it over to the squadron leader, and gone home.
But undaunted, Bader pressed on. Over northern France, one of his squadrons spotted German Messerschmitts below and called Bader. Bader hadn't noticed them, but, ever keen to improve his score, he wanted to lead the attack himself. Precious seconds were lost while he located the Germans. Suddenly, more trouble appeared from above.
Meanwhile, no one else had noticed a bunch of 109s up here. So eventually, when we did go down to attack, and were just about to open fire, then we got another bunch of 109s opening fire on us. And I remember seeing the yellow sort of golf balls coming across the top of my head. And we all broke in all over the place. And the sky was just full of a great mass of circling and twisting and turning aeroplanes, possibly 100 or something like that. And that's the last time I saw him.
Suddenly there was silence, utter silence. And we were on, I think we were just about on our way out then. And we all flew out, you know, great apprehension, wondering what had happened to Douglas in this complete silence.
In fact, Bader had become separated from his number two. According to the rule book, he should have dived low and flown straight home. Instead, he spotted a gaggle of Messerschmitts and recklessly went after them. Reach for the Sky shows Bader's version of what happened next. He always refused to believe that any German pilot could have shot him down, and claimed instead that he collided with a Messerschmitt. Reach for the Sky then shows how it was only by freeing himself from his tin leg that he was able to get out. But this idea of a collision is almost certainly untrue. Long after the war, Adolpho Galland, the Luftwaffe commander in northern France, gave the German, and probably correct version, to Laddie Lucas.
He said, "You must get this right. There was no collision. Douglas was shot down, and he was shot down by an Oberfeldwebel." And so I said, "Well, my God, Adolpho, he's not going to like that." And so I told Douglas this story. I said, "You didn't collide. You were shot down by an Oberfeldwebel, a flight sergeant." "Well," he said, "if that's the case, oh boy, and because it was me and he was a flight sergeant, why didn't they have the bugger goose-stepping down the Unter den Linden?" Well, what else could you say?
Bader was captured by the Germans. For them, it was a propaganda coup. They treated him like a celebrity, even inviting him to dinner. But he'd still have to spend the next 4 years as a prisoner of war. After the war, he found himself being interviewed by a fellow POW at a charity dinner. He was gung-ho about the old days.
I can remember you being carted out of Bluff 3, wasn't it?
Really, you were there too, were you? Yeah. What were you shot down in?
Oh, I was in Hamdens. We were the people who won the war, you know.
Yes, I'm so sorry. Yes, of course you did. I beg your pardon. Yes, silly of me. Yes, I remember Telegraph 3 very well. We had a bit of trouble with the Germans, as you remember, and they came along and took me away.
In Reach for the Sky, Barder's fellow prisoners are shown applauding his German baiting.
Good old Douglas! Put him inside,
He's inspecting the bastards.
But this image of the popular prisoner is pure myth, as Kenneth Moore, the actor who played Barder, later found out when he was asked to address an Air Force function.
This person in charge of it said, well, what were you going to sort of talk about? Oh, well, he said, you know, I thought I'd talk about Douglas Barder. Whereupon this man absolutely recoiled and said, don't you do that here. He said, see all those people over there, they were all in prison with him. And they got absolutely fed up with his antics, you know, and always they were forever having their Red Cross parcels taken away because of some schoolboyish prank he'd played on the Germans.
We all admired him immensely. He was a bloody nuisance at times.
Doing
what we call goon baiting, and somewhat overdoing it at times, you know, because, you know, he went a little bit far.
On one occasion, Barder suggested he and two of his fellow prisoners, one of them Paddy Barthrop, mess up the German count of a parade. With his tin legs, he was left behind, while they charged in and got punished.
We both got 28 days in the cooler. When I got back, I said to him, thank you very much, what's your next trick, you know?
What did Barder say to you?
Oh, balls, old boy, you know. It was fun. It might have been fun for you, it wasn't for us two.
Paddy Barthrop forgave Barder and became one of his closest friends. But others didn't. In addition to his over-the-top goon baiting, he got a damaging reputation for trying to muscle in on other prisoners' escapes.
Prisoners of war that had hoped to escape until he got in the way. I mean, I think they thought he was a right bastard, you know, because I think he spoiled quite a few attempts.
God, they'd say that bastard. We were prisoners of war together. And what does he do? He's always trying to escape. He's got those artificial legs. He can't run. He tries to. The challenge again. He was going to get out. Didn't care what price he had to pay for it, but they did.
Amazingly, despite his legs, Barder did once get away, escaping from a work party. The Germans sent out a nationwide warrant for his recapture. After that, they decided to move him to more secure accommodation. His fellow prisoners were not displeased to see him go.
It has been said, or I don't believe, when he was finally moved to Colditz, people were sort of clapping as he went out. I think a lot of them were clapping because we were going to bloody Colditz. Get rid of the bugger.
Perhaps inevitably, Colditz was Barder's final wartime destination. There, he was with an elite of determined escapers and kindred spirits.
Douglas Barder up a bit younger then, though, weren't we? Yeah. Well, you didn't step very well today. Yeah.
We returned to Colditz with two former inmates, Major Jack Pringle and Alec Ross, a medical orderly who'd met Barder in his previous camp and asked if he could go with him to Colditz as his Batman. Their first impressions of Barder were not dissimilar.
A very strong, ebullient, happy character.
Oh, I thought he was a great man at first, until I got to sort of know him personally.
Barder's quarters were two steep flights of stairs up from the courtyard.
Oh, well, this is the room. Yeah. This is where I used to squat down, pick Douglas Barder. I remember that. His bed. It's pretty heavy. Yeah.
Alec Ross's morning routine was arduous.
He'd get onto my back without his legs, just a short pair of pants on, carry him down two flights of stairs, drop him in the side of the bath, and he would get into the bath, have a bath. I sat and waited for him till he'd finished. Then he got up on the edge of the bath, I'd have been down, get him on my back, and carry him up another two flights of stairs back up. It's all right going down, but sometimes when he came up, he hadn't properly dried, and I was saturated by the time he got up. And if he felt like falling, he used to dig his stumps into my side. He used to nearly knock the breath out of me. I don't think all the time I knew him he said please or thank you to me.
Why not?
It's just his way, I expect. I mean, I was only just a little squirt compared with him when I...
Jack Pringle observed Barder's relationship with his Batman.
He doesn't appear to have ever said please or thank you.
No, I think that probably happened with other people too, because this is where I think his egoism comes in, because he was so remarkable. He himself knew he was remarkable, and so I deserve special treatment. And if I get it, that's what I deserve. I'm owed that. That attitude, obviously, is what kept him going under some terrible conditions. But it certainly was there. You see, he'd been made a hero of, and he believed that himself. He didn't boast about it, but he certainly believed it.
In mid-1944, the Allies and the Germans agreed an exchange of captured medical personnel. Alec Ross, who'd been a POW since 1940, was eligible to return home. He heard the news in the Colditz courtyard.
Douglas Bader called me over, and he said that the old Red Cross were being repatriated. So I said, oh, that's good. He said, not for you. He says, you're not going. He says, you came here with me and you're going to stay with me, and that was it. So I could really have cried, you know, when to think that all my mates that taken prisoner with me, all the Red Cross, you know, stretcher bears were all going home, and I was still stuck here.
But Barder would never have doubted that his needs came first. In part, it was because the very quality which made him fearless could also make him utterly insensitive.
He had very little imagination, which was why he was so brave. I don't mean that in a deprecatory way, because I've known other soldiers or airmen who had no imagination at all. They were just brave because they just did what there was to do without imagining that they might get shot or might get blown up. Douglas had no such imagination, and it made life much easier for him in some ways.
Alec Ross had the last laugh. In 1945, as soon as Colditz was liberated, Barder was whisked away by an American journalist. He didn't take his spare pair of legs and assumed Alec Ross would carry them home. Instead, Ross arranged for them to be sent on later.
So when I got back to England, I rang him up, and first thing he said, did you bring my legs? And I said no. So the words he said can't be mentioned. He just slammed the phone down. That's the last I heard of him.
Oh, what did he call you?
No, I shouldn't say that. You begins with a C, but there you are.
9 years after the war, Reach for the Sky made Douglas Bader a household name.
Suddenly, this rejected child, everybody wanted him. And I mean, after the film, he became one of the most famous people in the world.
Worldwide stardom finally gave Bader the status to match his ambition. In his campaigning for the disabled, he used it to brilliant effect. He'd travel anywhere, anytime, to encourage a fellow sufferer. His outstanding quality and defect was his total fearlessness. He was both extraordinarily brave and reckless, an idol to many, egotistic and insufferable to some.
He could be bloody rude, extremely rude at times. I don't think he meant it, but if he was in a particularly bad mood, he'd go for somebody for no apparent reason. Where if you knew him well, you just let it brush on one side.
Sometimes afterwards I said, God, that was bloody rude, you know. I mean, why were you like that? Why was I like what? What was the matter? And I said, you were awful. I just wanted to curl up and die. Why? What did I say? Oh, they can't be offended at that. Stupid people, you know. So.
If the reality didn't always fit the myth, the legless fighter pilot was the perfect symbol for a nation fighting back from adversity. But few heroes are without their flaws.
I don't think I'd have liked him much when he was young, actually.
Why not?
I told him that. He said, oh, well, I've mellowed in my old age. And I said, my God, if you've mellowed, I would hate to have known you when you were younger.